A strategist at Swedbank, a Swedish bank, has warned that the regional banking crisis in the U.S. is spreading. After several bank failures, he stressed that PacWest Bank, Western Alliance Bank, and First Horizon Bank have all been subject to financial meltdowns. First Republic Bank was seized by regulators last week and most of its assets were sold to J.P. Morgan Chase. It was the biggest U.S. bank failure since 2008. Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank collapsed in March. Following the seizure of First Republic Bank, shares of several banks.
Deutsche Bank trading lower after a price spike in credit default swaps on Thursday night has proven to be a warning sign for wary investors following the recent collapse of Swiss bank Credit Suisse. You can see shares down more than 3.1%. Joining us now to break down the latest with Deutsche Bank and what it could mean for investors here in the U.S. is Reese Williams, Chief Strategist at Spouting Rock Asset Management. Good to see you, sir. So here is the word from German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who said there is no reason whatsoever to be concerned. Is he right?
Well, we can only hope so. Obviously, the last weekend is remembering the last weekend when the Credit Suisse CEO said everything was fine too, and the bankers in Switzerland also thought everything was fine. So, I mean, the difference is there is no big brother for Deutsche Bank to go to, and so I do think they will pull out all stops. And really, right now you have a liquidity issue, not a credit issue yet. So I think what we need to do is the federal bank, the Federal Reserves of the world, and the ECB in this instance, really needs to protect the banking system as job one and kind of worry about inflation later. And I just think as long as they would, have that message, each and every hour of each and every day, I think we could probably get through this without the huge kind of hard landing risks that we potentially have for ignoring a banking crisis.
Reese, you mentioned that the need to pull out all stops. You just talked about what the regulators need to do. What is Deutsche Bank? What do we need to hear from some of those executives right now?
Well, I mean, the problem is, no, it's hard for the CEO to get on TV and say everything's fine. I really do think everything's fine with Deutsche Bank, though. They do have adequate capital levels, and I do think also, unfortunately they do have, I think, lots of relationships with other banks, and so potentially you could move your money from Deutsche Bank to J.P. Morgan, just as the same phenomenon that's going on in the regional banking crisis here. So that's why I do think that protecting the system is very important, and I think every regulator needs to think about that, and I think say basically the Mario Draghi line of we're going to do what it takes, and I think Deutsche Bank is a systemically important bank and needs to be protected at all costs.
Reese, do you get a sense of who's next in this game of whack-a-mole, and how much of it at this point is purely emotional?
I think it's mostly emotional now. Really, what we have is liquidity problems, not a credit problem yet. But it's one of these things where, at least in the U.S. banking system, with the regional banks all going down dramatically everywhere, there's going to be less loans given, and because their cost of funds are actually going up in this period of time, they're going to charge more for those loans, which means customers are going to have to pay more for loans, which is deflationary, not inflationary. So I really do think the Federal Reserve, all politicians need to think about one thing, and that is let's save the banking system first and foremost. Let's get calmness there, and then we can worry about inflation a couple months from now. But I think really job one is protecting the system, because what's going on right now is the Fed is looking at the rearview mirror and not looking at the windshield whatsoever.
Reese, all of the concern right now that's playing out within the banking sector, not just the European plays, we also seen it a bit reflected in some of the larger U.S. banks, specifically also the regionals. That's obviously where we've seen most of the selling here in terms of the U.S. banks. How much of that fear do you think is overblown, if at all?
I think currently the fear is overblown, but this is all a confidence game. And like I said, I think the health of the economy is pretty good. The coincident indicators are fine. The question is, if this continues, what happens to the go forward? And I think that's where we need to look firmly in the windshield and say, we need to stabilize things now. And I do think, for instance, some sort of discussion about guaranteeing all deposits in the U.S. would go a long way to stemming the crisis. I think until something along those lines happens, and I realize it probably needs congressional authority, but these guys can stick around a weekend. Let's get this done. There was a lot of tough votes during the 2008 crisis, much tougher votes actually than that, because protecting depositors is not protecting stockholders. I do think the effect will be, if you protect depositors, you will protect stockholders, but you don't have to make that de facto pledge.
And Reese, if the Fed were looking out the windshield, to your point, what would they be focusing on and how would they act?
Well, for instance, and this is just how they calculate CPI. The CPI inflation, I think, is actually less in reality than the stated number, and the reason is, rents are a quarter of CPI, and rents are actually going up about 2%, not the 8%, because the way they calculate it is sort of a weighted average of the last 12 months. So I think the problem with what they're doing is they're not looking at the kind of what's going on real time, that things are really starting to slow. And their mission seems to be, we've got to be acting very tough on inflation. And that, to me, is, they've won that battle more or less. Now what they need to do is, stop putting on the brakes to avoid a hard landing. And I think that's really what they need to, have a consistent message of, instead of the, some people saying something, some people saying the other, Bullard.